Hi, this is PHLT 509, Cultural Dimensions of Health, Module 6 on Data Collection in Ethnography. It might seem a little bit strange for us to approach research ethics, as we did in Module 5, ahead of an in-depth discussion of how to actually carry out an ethnographic investigation. But it's important to foreground the ethical considerations so that as you think about collecting data, you'll be thinking about how to do so in a manner that is sensitive to the ethical and the power issues that might arise. So throughout your reading and your listening to the mini lecture for this module, I hope that you will be keeping those ethical considerations in mind and thinking about how you might carry out your ethnographic investigation, your data collection, in a way which is not only feasible and going to yield the kind of data that you need for an ethnographic investigation, but also one which is carried out ethically, and particularly with the well-being of your research participants in mind. The short chapter by Ditzapelo McFarland in the Duchesne Reader provides a step-by-step account of what typically happens in ethnographic research. You might also find it helpful to go back and look again at Chapter 3 in this volume on ethnographic methods. But Edberg argues that we need to begin our thinking with at least a cursory exploration of research philosophies. And he notes that when researching culture, we are especially interested in gaining other people's points of view and their subjective experience. Thus, we cannot enter the research with predefined hypotheses or even overspecified research questions. And for those of you coming from a very scientific background, this might be quite difficult to take on board or accept because you have been inculcated into a way of thinking about research that's very question-driven and hypothesis-driven. And the philosophy behind ethnographic research is quite different from that viewpoint. We identify a topic of interest, and within a limited context, we're seeking to understand from the point of view of the people who live in that context. So qualitative ethnographic research, therefore, is admittedly of limited generalizability. We're not trying to answer any questions about how all members of a particular group behave or believe, but rather to understand in a much deeper way what people believe and do, and most importantly, why. As Edberg states on page 136, in a qualitative research effort, you are not limited to a predetermined set of questions, so the opportunity for collecting more complete and contextualized data is greater. We want to understand things as they're perceived within a particular culture or context, and this might require us to set aside our own notions and questions about objective reality. As an approach to research, ethnography draws on many different methods of data collection, and these will include interviews, informal conversations, which you may or may not think of as a type of interview, examination of documents, and its trademark method, participant observation. Ethnographic studies may have somewhat less clearly defined research questions than other forms of research, and their aim is to develop thick, rich description of cultural practices and beliefs. However, even in a large-scale ethnography, it's obviously not possible to observe every interaction or to understand every facet of the culture under study, so it's important to have an idea at the outset of what topics the researcher wishes to focus on, which events will be important to observe, although that may be subject to revision once you get into a community and start learning what events are really important, or perhaps even learning about events that you hadn't been aware of previously, and which people will be important to talk to, although again, a degree of flexibility here is important, because additional events and people might become more important as the research progresses. Planning is important in ethnography. For instance, to gain access to the place, it would be the study site, but ethnography, more than most types of research, is also iterative. That is, it involves evaluation and planning after each small step of the research. and it's flexible enough to take advantage of serendipitous events. I mentioned participant observation as a key methodology, and I've given you an exercise in Module 6 in which you're going to undertake some observation and some participant observation and make notes about what you see and also about your experience of being a participant observer. And this methodology involves the researcher not only in observing, as a scientist might observe the natural world, but also in recognition that all of us, including researchers, are social beings, and we take part in the activities that we're studying. Active participation can give a much richer understanding of an activity than simply watching. If you imagine the difference between taking part in a conversation or entering a race as opposed to the experience of being a spectator on the sidelines, you can understand that it's a very different experience, and you can have a much deeper understanding of what it feels like actually to take part in an event or an activity. Think about your own examples, as an example, your own experience in a new work environment, perhaps. You probably learned to carry out the jobs required of you partly through receiving training and watching others, but then you deepened your understanding of what the work really entails only after performing that job yourself over a period of time. And the degree to which you'll be able to participate in the activities that you observe will vary greatly from one setting to another. And you probably will need to adopt a flexible approach to opportunities that arise. Traditionally, ethnographers would be advised to spend a large amount of time, maybe a year or more, immersing themselves in the culture of study. We call this being in the field. To learn the local language, which might mean learning new jargons or dialects of one's own language even, and to take part as fully as possible in local activities. Recording such activities, as well as the researcher's impressions and interpretations in the form of field notes, is very important in ethnographic research. Sometimes it'll be appropriate to record notes about events, encounters, or interviews as they take place. And other times it might feel more appropriate to write up your notes in private as soon after the event as possible. Bear in mind, however, that there are ethical concerns with covert observation or deception and recording of people's activities. So it may be that recording your notes at a particular time or in a particular setting doesn't seem to be appropriate. That doesn't mean, however, that one can be an ethnographer without informing the people that one is undertaking activities as a researcher. Generally, it's best to be open with your informants about the reasons for your involvement and observations, and these kinds of ethical issues, if you're ever unsure or inclined to some question about the extent of disclosure that's appropriate, these should be carefully discussed with a supervisor or instructor before beginning a piece of participant observation research. And finally, I just want to mention a little bit about writing research proposals. You should read the appendices of the Duchesne book, which describe proposals for ethnographic research, and a few general tips on writing good research proposals. They will tend to have very clear research questions and aims so that the reviewer can understand exactly what you want to find out. A clear and sound theoretical basis, a justification for the methodology. In other words, why is this the best way to find out what you want to know? A detailed description of the methodology. So if you say you're going to use participant observation, explain where you're going to go, what sort of people you hope to hang out with, what sorts of events you hope to observe, how you intend to participate, how you intend to obtain informed consent. A thoughtful discussion of the ethical considerations and the limitations of the research, but also perhaps a discussion of who might benefit from this research. And then practical questions like a realistic timetable, and if you're seeking a budget to carry out the research, then showing that your work will represent good value for money is always important also. So I look forward to reading your proposals and your IRB forms next week. Please email me or call me if you have any questions at all or anything else that you'd like to discuss along the way. Thanks.